Yes, please, this is an emergency. Please send a squad to Pierce Butler Road, Molenberg Manufacturing Company, machine shop. Please, there's an ambulance too. There's a girl hurt there.
Can you tell me what happened to her?
Just hurry, she's laying on the ground in the back by the railroad tracks, by the edge here. Hurry.
What's the address?
I don't know.
Who are you?
January 1st, 1981. Just past midnight, celebrations in downtown St. Paul in Minnesota are in full swing. But after getting into an argument at a party, 20-year-old Karen Potac storms off. She doesn't tell anybody that she's leaving. She doesn't even take her coat. Walking down an alleyway in nothing but her red dress, Karen shivers from the cold. But as she emerges back on the street, a car pulls up beside her. The man driving introduces himself as Paul and, seeing how cold she is, offers her a ride, which she gladly accepts. Paul begins driving before even finding out where she wants to go, telling her that he's just doing it to get the heat going in the car to help warm her up. Karen is not familiar with the area, having come down from Wisconsin to spend New Year's Eve with her sisters. So she doesn't realise that Paul isn't heading back towards the busy downtown. Instead, he drives her out to the Molenberg machine shop, stopping in a dark, secluded spot behind the building where nobody is able to see them. And then he switches off the engine. Questioning what he's doing, Paul ignores Karen. He gets out of the car, walks around to the trunk, and retrieves a tire iron, making sure to hide it from her as he returns. Then, he orders her to get out of the car. Terrified, Karen refuses to obey his order. So Paul attacks. He strikes her over the head with the tire iron, knocking her unconscious. Then, he drags her out of the car and tosses her carelessly onto the ground. With Karen lying unconscious in the snow, Paul then begins to strike her with the tire iron, hitting her more than 12 times and cracking her skull. Once he's finished, he jumps back into his car and speeds away, leaving Karen's lifeless body lying in the blood-soaked snow. But shortly after, for reasons nobody but him will ever truly understand, Paul stops at a payphone and makes the call you heard at the start of this video. Speaking in a shaky, high-pitched and extremely emotional voice, he tells the dispatcher where Karen is and asks them to send an ambulance before he hangs up the phone. When police arrive at the Molenberg machine shop, they are quickly able to locate Karen. Surrounded by blood and her skull so badly beaten that part of her brain is exposed, they are shocked to discover that she is somehow still alive. Rushed into hospital in critical condition, detectives scour the crime scene for evidence. But they find nothing to help them discover who was responsible for the horrific attack, or even why they had done it. There are no signs of sexual assault, and none of her belongings have been stolen, ruling both out as potential motives. With Karen defying all expectations and managing to survive, the detectives are hopeful that she'll be able to tell them who was responsible for attacking her, or at least provide them with some details pointing them in the right direction. But unfortunately, it becomes quickly apparent that Karen has sustained serious brain injuries from the assault, and as a result, she has no memory at all of the events that unfolded that cold New Year's Eve. The only real clue the detectives had was the emergency call, which they knew had to have been made by the attacker himself. But with no way of working out who had made it, it wasn't long before the case began to turn cold. At least, until Paul struck again, because Paul was, in reality, an extremely volatile and disturbed serial killer, and the next time he attacked, he made sure his victim wasn't going to survive.
Oh, you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody.
And after almost every one of his attacks, until he was finally apprehended, Paul continued to contact the police. Sobbing and seeming to express remorse in the same high-pitched, tearful voice, he soon gained the nickname. Before we continue, I just want to say that if you find this video interesting, don't forget to drop a like and feel free to let me know your thoughts about it down in the comment section below. These videos take me a long time to research, write and produce, and these sorts of small actions really help give them a boost in the YouTube algorithm. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing and checking out some of my other true crime cases. And if you're not new, I'm sure you'll have noticed that something sounds a little bit different in this video. On my last case about the love slave killers, I showed you what my real voice sounds like, and I asked if you'd prefer to hear my videos being narrated by myself instead of my usual voiceover. And seeing as most of you said that you would, this is me following through on my promise to narrate my next case myself. I know the narration isn't going to be perfect, and I'll hopefully learn and improve over time. But if you all ultimately decide you prefer me using my real voice to read my scripts, then I'll continue doing it from now on. With all that said, let's get back to the story. Paul Michael Stephani was born in 1944 as the sixth of 10 children, growing up on a 5-acre farm just outside of Austin, Minnesota. With his family being devout Catholics, Paul learnt the power of confession from a young age, being told every week at church how important it was to unburden his soul after committing sinful acts. Whether this ingrained religious belief was the reason why he felt compelled to confess to his later crimes, however, is unknown. It's possible that Paul was overwhelmed by guilt or genuine remorse, struggling with urges and impulses he felt like he couldn't control, leading to his emotional confessions. Yet I find it easy to picture him making the emotional phone calls before hanging up and having a completely expressionless face, or even, perhaps more chillingly, a smile. Many serial killers want people to know what they've done, and many of them are incredible manipulators and actors. So could Paul's tearful confessions have actually just been like a performance, an added extra moment to savor what he'd done and enhance the rush that it gave him? At a very young age, Paul's parents divorced, with his mother remarrying when he was only 3 years old. But his stepfather was just as intensely religious as his mother, and he took it upon himself to make sure his Catholic belief system was instilled deep into his stepchildren. To enforce his beliefs, his stepfather didn't hesitate to use violence. If Paul or any of his siblings disobeyed him, questioned him, or angered him, he would hit them, and on some occasions, even throw them down the stairs. This combination of rigid religious teachings and physical violence and abuse undoubtedly had a profound impact on how young Paul came to understand the world. He claims he found himself struggling to deal with his emotions, constantly overwhelmed by feelings of guilt, shame, and anger. As a result of it all, Paul left home in the early 1960s, right after graduating high school, moving over 100 miles north to St. Paul in Minnesota. There, he found work with anyone that would employ him, moving through various temporary janitorial and labor-intensive jobs. Eventually, by the mid-1970s, he found solid employment as a janitor at the Malmberg Manufacturing Company, the exact same place he would later take Karen to, before attacking her. Struggling to maintain friendships and relationships, Paul's emotional instability only seemed to worsen as he moved into adulthood. That is, until he met a woman called Beverly Lyder, marrying her at the age of 26 in 1970. Soon after, the couple had a daughter together, and for the first time it seemed like Paul's life was finally on the right track. He had a good job, a loving wife and child, and a seemingly happy, stable life. But it wasn't long before things began to fall apart. Although the specific details of exactly what happened are scarce, Paul's marriage ended in divorce 5 years later in 1975. Still deeply and devoutly Catholic, Paul struggled with the stigma surrounding his divorce, bringing his feelings of shame and guilt back to the forefront. And soon, he found these feelings transforming into an overwhelming anger and resentment towards not only Beverly, who he felt was responsible for unraveling his life, but towards all women. He completely cut ties with Beverly, abandoning his daughter and having no involvement in her life whatsoever. And just when he felt at his lowest, and like he was losing control of his emotions, in 1977, he was fired from his job at the Malmberg Manufacturing Company. Feeling like he'd lost everything, Paul completely spiraled out of control. He felt like everything was going wrong in his life, and there was nothing he could do about it. Then one day he snapped. Though details are again vague and difficult to ascertain, Paul attacked a woman, leading him to be convicted and registered as a violent offender after serving what appears to have been a very short sentence. After this run-in with the law, Paul tried to suppress his tumultuous feelings, managing to secure a new job, and even to begin dating a woman from Syria. But then, in 1980, she left him too, returning to Syria to marry someone else in an arranged ceremony. Already emotionally volatile, the breakdown of this relationship pushed Paul to his absolute limits. His anger and resentment became entirely focused on women, who he began believing were responsible for all of the problems in his life. And when New Year's Eve came around and he found himself completely alone, with no family, no friends, and no loved ones to celebrate with, he chose to stop suppressing his feelings and let them out. Driving through downtown St. Paul, he spotted Karen walking alone in her red dress around 1 a.m. Whether he had always planned to harm someone that night, or he simply lost control, is unclear. But at some point, as he drove her through the icy streets, a voice in his head urged him to hurt her, to dominate her, to make her suffer. This same voice, Paul would later claim, compelled him to commit all of his violent acts. He drove her to the Malmberg machine shop where he had worked for years before being fired, likely only intensifying his rage, and attacked her. But as he drove away, something compelled him to confess what he'd just done. so he pulled over by a phone booth and called 911, crying down the phone as he said the following.
Yes, please, this is an emergency. Please send a squad to Pierce Butler Road, Molenberg Manufacturing Company, machine shop. Please, there's an ambulance too. There's a girl hurt there.
Can you tell me what happened to her?
Just hurry, she's laying on the ground in the back by the railroad tracks, by the edge here. Hurry.
What's the address?
I don't know.
Who are you?
Afterwards, he drove home, and over the following days, he closely watched the news for updates about the investigation into what he'd done. But as days and even weeks passed and nobody showed up to arrest him, Paul realized that he had gotten away with it. If Paul truly did regret what he'd done, as his phone call made it sound like, then there must have been some part of him that he could not control that felt very differently. Some part of him that was desperate to feel that intense rush again. Because only a few months later, the voice inside his head told him it was time to act again. And this time, he was going to make sure his victim did not survive his attack. On June 3rd, 1981, Paul was eating at a diner when he spotted 18-year-old Kimberly Compton wearing a red jacket. He approached her and began chatting with her, learning that she had recently graduated from high school and had just moved to the area from Wisconsin that very day. So Paul offered to drive her to the river for a picnic and to even give her a tour if she fancied it. Happy to have made a new friend in the city, Kimberly unfortunately agreed to go with him. According to Paul, he had no conscious intention of harming Kimberly. But while he was driving with her, the voice inside his head began talking to him again, telling him to kill, and he no longer felt in control of his actions. While it's possible this is true, and it could go some way to explaining his emotional confession calls if you believe they're real, to me, it comes across more as a way for Paul to absolve himself of his sins and to shift responsibility away from himself. Paul drove her out to a secluded spot, telling Kimberly to walk ahead and check out the amazing view of the river. Meanwhile, he retrieved an ice pick from the trunk of his car. See what I was just saying about not taking his own explanation too seriously? Because, we don't all just casually have ice picks in the trunks of our cars in the middle of summer, do we? It seems pretty clear why the weapon was there, and what Paul's intentions were from the get-go that day. If he really had been suddenly overtaken by this voice, this other personality, then it feels unlikely he'd have been so prepared for what he was about to do. Keeping the ice pick hidden from view, Paul joined Kimberly on the grass by the river. As the two of them listened to the sound of running water, he suddenly leaned over and stabbed her with it. The attack was brutal. Paul stabbed her 61 times with the ice pick in her chest, stomach, and inner thighs, but even after he'd finished, he didn't stop his assault. He took one of her shoelaces off of her shoes and strangled her with it. Then he pushed her body away from the riverbank, out of the open so it would be more difficult to find, before he tossed the blood-soaked ice pick as far as he could into the river. Mere hours later, Paul picked up a payphone, dialed 911, and confessed what he had done.
Oh, you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody.
Once again, his voice was high-pitched, overly emotional, and difficult to understand. This initially led detectives to believe that it was a hoax, as it sounded too ridiculous to be real. However, around half an hour after the call, 3 teenage boys playing on a nearby construction site stumbled across Kimberly's body in the bushes, initially thinking they had found a mannequin. Yeah, I know. They immediately called the police once they realized it was a real body. When investigators arrived, it was clear Kimberly had been murdered with some sort of sharp object, which they initially believed to be a screwdriver. Although she had no identification on her, a single key in her pocket led them to a Greyhound bus locker in St. Paul, where they found her belongings and were able to confirm who she was. But just like with Karen's crime scene, they found nothing to indicate a specific motive beyond murder itself. She had not been robbed or sexually assaulted, and they found no clues directing them towards a suspect. When Kimberly's autopsy confirmed that an ice pick had been used to make the 61 puncture wounds on her body, it became clear that the phone call made just before she was discovered had to have been real and made by her killer, as there was no other way he could have known that an ice pick was used in the murder. And with no other clues, their top priority became identifying who had made the phone call. But it was a very short call, and back then the technology just didn't exist to easily identify where it had come from. But luckily for them, Paul seemingly couldn't stop himself from confessing, and 2 days later, he called again, using the same high-pitched and overly emotional voice. Though this call was not recorded, Paul stayed on the phone long enough for them to trace the call to a phone booth at the very bus depot where Kimberly had first arrived. But by the time any officers had made it to the location, Paul had already vanished, and they were no closer to finding him than when they started. While they attempted to gather fingerprints from the phone booth, it was so covered in prints from the hundreds of people who had used it that they failed to collect any useful samples. And none of the potential witnesses in the area were able to recall anything useful for them either. But then, on June 11th, after spending days watching news stories about the murder he had committed, Paul called to confess once again, this time stating,
Don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry what I did to Compton. I couldn't help it. Don't know why I had to stab her. I am so upset about it. I keep getting drunk every night. I can't believe it. It's just like a big dream. I can't think of being locked up. If I get locked up, I'll kill myself. I'd rather kill myself than get locked up. I'll try not to kill anybody else.
Interestingly, this call in some ways answers why Paul wouldn't just turn himself in if he truly wanted to be stopped, like he claimed in his previous call. He was afraid of being imprisoned, yet I'm not so sure these calls were motivated by guilt or remorse, like Paul has claimed, or like he tries to make it sound on them with his clearly exaggerated emotional distress. Some criminologists have proposed that Paul wanted to tell the police it was their job to catch him, so if they failed, then it was on them if he killed again, and not him. Especially since he was apparently trying so hard not to kill anybody else. Were the calls just another way to sidestep responsibility for his actions? A way to claim that it was the voices in his head, the dissociative state that made him kill, and the police's fault for not stopping him? One of the officers listening to the call this time recognized the distinctive voice from a previous case he had worked on, the attack of Karen Potac, almost 6 months earlier. And when detectives listened to the calls next to one another, there was no doubt that they were made by the same person. But even though Karen had survived, she had no memory of her attacker and there were no clues or suspects in her case either. Except now they knew that this was definitely not an isolated incident. With 2 young women viciously attacked just miles apart, they now suspected that their high-pitched caller was in fact a serial killer, one who was likely going to strike again. So they released portions of the phone calls to the media, hoping that somebody might recognize the unique voice. And before long, journalists had created a nickname for Paul, the Weepy Voiced Killer. Meanwhile, the detectives began looking into possible connections between Karen and Kimberly, but the only link between the 2 women they could find was that both of them had been wearing red when they had been attacked. Assisting with the investigation, FBI profilers theorized that the color red could perhaps be a trigger for the killer, so the police issued a warning to the public, urging women in the area to avoid wearing red completely. If Paul's true goal was to feel in control and powerful, this likely gave him an enormous rush. Because now, he wasn't just controlling his victims, he was controlling thousands of women who were afraid to dress how they wanted because of him. Unfortunately, despite receiving a lot of tips about who the voice might belong to, nobody came forward with solid information. And despite dominating headlines in the Twin Cities area, the case was quickly turning cold. But then, a couple of months later in August, a man called Alan Lopez suddenly confessed to the murder of Kimberly. Alan was trapped in a standoff with a SWAT team after taking his family hostage and threatening to kill them, and while dealing with the negotiator, he revealed that he had supposedly killed Kimberly Compton already. When the standoff finally ended with the discovery that Alan had already killed both of his parents and his sister, he was arrested and taken into custody, where detectives on the Weepy Voiced Killer case began interrogating him regarding his confession. Yet it became quickly clear that Alan was not the man who had made the calls, and that his confession had just been part of some ill-thought-out negotiation tactic. But while they could rule out his voice as being the one on the phone calls, they couldn't say with 100% certainty that he wasn't in some way involved in the case. Regardless, by the following February, he had taken his own life in jail, leaving the thread unresolved for the detectives. At least, until the true killer struck again. Around a year later, on July 21st, 1982, Paul once again found himself unable to contain his dark urges. However, his next murder was very different from the rest of his crimes. Because of this, Paul's own much later account of what happened is all we have to go off of, making it even more difficult to determine fact from fiction. Driving through the suburbs of Lauderdale, Paul claims the voice once again appeared in his head telling him to kill, and he entered a dissociative state as his darkness took over him. And that's when he saw 33-year-old Kathleen Greening packing up her car outside her apartment for a weekend trip she had planned. It's possible that she was also wearing red, but if that was the case, Paul never mentioned it in his account of what happened. Parking his car across the road, Paul waited until she had finished packing and there was nobody else on the street before he got out and calmly walked over to her front door. And when he tried the handle, he found that it was unlocked. As he moved silently through the building, Paul made his way towards the bathroom where he could hear the sound of running bath water. Before Kathleen could even scream, he lunged into the room and grabbed her. And without a second's thought, he began strangling her and shoved her head into the bathtub, holding it under the water. Though he claims he questioned what he was doing as he watched her drowning, he didn't stop until she was dead. And unlike his previous attacks, this time he did not call the police and confess. Instead, he left her dead body half submerged in the bathtub and drove to his church, where he claims he prayed and wept. When her lifeless body was discovered in her bathtub, law enforcement ruled her death as an accidental drowning. Not even realizing she had been murdered, they made no connection to the Weepy Voiced Killer case. Although this conclusion was eventually changed, with her death being deemed as a homicide, the case was completely cold for almost 2 decades. Intriguingly, years later it would be discovered that a phone number in her address book listed as Paul S. actually belonged to Paul. While it's possible Paul added this into the book as some sort of weird form of confessing, it seems much more likely that his number was in her address book because she knew him. And this raises a few interesting questions. Did Paul target her for a specific reason, rather than the almost random nature of his other crimes? Did he make the choice not to call the police in this instance because he knew they might be able to link him to Kathleen in some manner? Could it even be possible that Kathleen was Paul's true target for some reason, and that everything else he did was part of an elaborate red herring to throw law enforcement off the scent? It's an interesting idea to think about, but it seems unlikely, given he did ultimately connect himself to the case. So exactly why everything about the crime was so vastly different from the rest of his attacks remains a mystery, because either Kathleen's murder is a complete anomaly in the case, featuring none of the elements of the rest of Paul's crimes, or there's something more to it that we just don't understand yet. I also can't help but consider that while Paul was able to definitively prove his involvement in her murder in his later confession, could his admission just be another part of a potential game he was playing with the authorities? If we accept that his confessions were not truly motivated by guilt and remorse, could Paul have been trying to hint that he was responsible for substantially more murders than the authorities were aware of by proving his involvement in such a different, detached case from the rest of his crimes? Only 2 weeks later, on August 5th, Paul struck again. This time, he targeted 40-year-old Barbara Simons after meeting her at the Hexagon Bar in Minneapolis. Once again, she was dressed in red. Paul approached her, asking if he could bum a cigarette, striking up a conversation with her. And after spending the rest of the night dancing and chatting together, by the end of the evening, Barbara felt comfortable enough to accept Paul's offer of a ride home. This was a bold move from Paul, who had previously stayed in the shadows. Here, he was openly engaging with his potential victim in front of countless witnesses in a public space. And unbeknownst to Paul, this overconfidence had backfired on him. Because right before they left, Barbara made sure to tell one of the waitresses she was leaving with him, pointing him out and laughing that she hoped he was okay. As you can already guess, Paul didn't drive her home. Instead, he took her to a secluded spot along the Mississippi River. There, hidden by darkness, he attacked her. Using either a screwdriver or another ice pick, Paul stabbed her more than 100 times. Then, he hid her body near the river and discarded his murder weapon. But just like with Kimberly, Paul did a terrible job at concealing his crime. And the very next morning, a paperboy discovered her body while making his deliveries along the banks of the river. Put in charge of the case, Detective Don Brown immediately believed that whoever was responsible for the excessively violent murder had likely killed before, based on the way they had tampered with the scene. As far as investigators in the Weepy Voiced Killer case were concerned, though, it had been over a year since he had killed, and no connection was initially made to Barbara's murder. At least not until Paul called 911 48 hours later and confessed, stating,
"Fire emergency."
Please don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry I killed that girl. I stabbed her 40 times. Kimberly, Compton was the first one. Oh, my safe. I don't know what's the matter with me. I'm sick. I'm going to kill myself, I think.
Where are you?
I'm just going to... If somebody dies with a red shirt on, it's me. I killed both of you. I'm sorry. I'll never make it to heaven.
Calm down.
After the call, there was no doubt that Barbara was another victim of the Weepy Voiced Killer, and there was now also no doubt that Alan Lopez was not involved, given he was already dead. This was also the first time Paul had openly admitted that he was targeting women wearing red, though he never elaborated any further on this, so the reason why remains unclear. Even with the teams from Minneapolis and St. Paul now working together, initially it seemed like another case with no witnesses, no evidence, and no clues for the detectives, who hadn't even been able to identify Barbara. But then, a postal worker discovered her purse in a mailbox. And with her identity confirmed, they were then able to trace her movements on the night she was murdered, learning that she had been at the Hexagon Bar. There, both the waitress and a bartender were able to provide them with a description of the man seen leaving with her. They told them that the suspect looked like he was in his 40s, was about 6 feet tall, and had dark hair and dark eyes. So the investigators began looking through lists of past offenders with assault charges in the area, compiling a photo lineup of 8 men they felt matched the description. They then took these images to the staff at the bar, and almost the second they looked at the pictures, they pointed to one of the men, identifying him as the person they had seen leaving with Barbara that night. It was Paul Michael Stephani. And as investigators began looking into Paul's background, an intriguing detail stood out to them. He used to work at the Marburg Manufacturing Company, the same place where Karen, the first victim they knew of, had been attacked on New Year's Day in 1981. Finally, they had a real suspect in the case, but they didn't have enough evidence to prove that he was the serial killer they had been hunting. Not yet, anyway. So they began surveilling his apartment. Meanwhile, Paul's dark urges were growing more and more overwhelming, and just 2 weeks after killing Barbara, he was ready to strike again. On August 21st, Paul drove to East Minneapolis. Although the surveillance team followed him, they lost track of him after a few hours of tailing his car, which was unfortunate because if they had managed to stay on him, they could have stopped what happened next. Because around midnight, Paul approached 19-year-old sex worker Denise Williams, who, like the rest of his victims, was wearing red. He offered her $100 for her services, which she accepted. After getting into his car, Paul drove her back to his apartment where they had sex. Denise had been a sex worker since the age of 13, and she was tough and street smart. Having dealt with many dangerous clients in her past, Paul gave her no reason to be afraid of him. So when he offered to give her a ride back to downtown Minneapolis after they'd finished, she happily accepted. But on the drive back, Denise began to grow uneasy when Paul did not drive onto the highway, as she'd have expected. Instead, he drove around side streets, reassuring her that he knew a better way back. And as they drove, he suddenly began telling her about all of his sexual fantasies. Everything inside of her was telling her that something was wrong, that she needed to run the second she got the chance. And she was right. Pulling into a dark, secluded parking lot, Paul switched off the engine and turned to Denise, telling her she was going to have to pay him for the ride, one way or another. Seizing the opportunity, Denise opened the door and tried to run for it, but Paul grabbed her by the arm and yanked her back inside. Struggling to break free from him, he suddenly lunged over and stabbed her in the stomach with a screwdriver. The pain was so intense that Denise wanted to stop fighting and let her body sink into the seat. But she knew if she did, she was going to die. Scrambling to find something to defend herself with, her hand latched onto an old glass bottle on the car floor. She swung up, shattering it on Paul's head. Left with a jagged shard of glass in her hand, she slashed desperately at him, cutting his face and slicing open his hand. As Paul screamed out in pain, he shoved her back, causing both of them to tumble out of the passenger door and onto the pavement. More consumed by anger and rage than ever, Paul disarmed her and pinned her to the ground as Denise screamed out for help, stabbing her over and over with the screwdriver. Her screams alerted Douglas Panning to the scene, a young man who lived nearby. He rushed over, grabbing Paul's arm to try and stop the attack. But Paul then turned on him, lunging at him with the screwdriver as Douglas scattered back, fleeing to the safety of his house to call the police. Panicked, Paul jumped back into his car and sped off, leaving Denise to bleed out in the parking lot with 15 stab wounds. When police arrived, Denise was rushed to hospital to treat her injuries. Despite having 15 puncture wounds, including one that pierced her lung and another that had pierced her liver, Denise had minimal external bleeding and was in surprisingly stable condition. Initially, she gave her name as Mary Gross, worried she might be arrested for violating probation due to a prior conviction. She told them that she had been hitchhiking, not wanting to admit she had engaged in prostitution. Knowing Paul had been in the area that night, before the detectives even had the chance to try and connect the attack to him, Paul contacted the authorities himself. When he arrived home, Paul had realized that his own wounds were far worse than he'd first thought. He claims that he then snapped out of his dissociative state and began worrying he was going to die. So he called 911, telling the dispatcher that he had been beaten and attacked and needed an ambulance. But Paul didn't know that the local 911 dispatchers had all been briefed about his case, as investigators wanted to try and trace any future calls he made, so they were all very familiar with his distinctive, high-pitched voice. And while he wasn't confessing to a murder this time, his emotional distress meant he was immediately recognizable as the Weepy Voiced Killer. So when an ambulance arrived and took him to the hospital, its doors opened to reveal police officers waiting for him. Having survived the attack, detectives brought a series of mugshots for Denise to look at, and she immediately identified Paul as her attacker. After Paul's injuries were treated, he was taken to the police station, with the detectives leading him to believe he was just being questioned about the attack he had claimed to be the victim of. Once in the interrogation room, Detective Brown listened to his story, pretending to believe him and putting him at ease. But then, he put a file on the table and opened it, revealing images of all of the Weepy Voiced Killer victims and crime scenes. In Detective Brown's own words, "In all my past experiences up to that point, I have never seen any person change personalities in front of me." Panicked and desperate, within seconds of seeing the images, Paul's voice had completely changed. It became high-pitched, strained and overly emotional. And as the detectives pushed him and made him increasingly agitated, his voice grew more and more hysterical. He sounded exactly the same as he had on the 911 calls, and they had no doubt that he was the Weepy Voiced Killer. Even with overwhelming evidence linking him to the attack on Denise and the murder of Barbara, Paul denied being the wanted serial killer or being involved in any of the cases. The same man who had spent years confessing to his crimes because he apparently felt so guilty and ashamed of what he'd done now refused to admit to anything. So the investigators turned to Paul's friends and family, including his sister and his ex-wife Beverly, to help confirm it was his voice on the recorded calls. They all confirmed that it was Paul's voice and even told them they would be willing to testify to it in court. However, despite his recorded confessions he made after his attack on Karen and the murder of Kimberly, there was no physical evidence linking him to either of the cases. So the authorities chose to only charge Paul with the attempted murder of Denise and the murder of Barbara, believing the two cases had the strongest evidence and the best chance at ensuring a conviction in court. With his trial beginning in 1984 and stretching all the way to April of 1985, Paul pled not guilty and continued to deny it was his voice on the calls, or that he was involved in the attacks. Among the witnesses presenting damning testimony against him were Denise and the man who had come to her rescue, Douglas. Denise described in terrifying detail the events on the night of Paul's final attack, including how she had caused the injuries on him that led to him calling 911 himself, with Douglas backing up her story. Both made it unequivocally clear that Paul was the attacker. Denise faced a tough cross-examination from the defense, who tried to discredit her because she had initially lied to the police, claiming she had been a hitchhiker and not a sex worker. But ultimately, this did little to undermine her powerful and disturbing testimony, which was backed up not only by Douglas, but by her various injuries, and even Paul's own injuries. While everyone else in Paul's life had known him as a quiet, somewhat awkward, devoutly Catholic man, he struggled to maintain his composure in the courtroom, revealing his darker side to everyone. He could barely contain his rage and anger, glaring at everyone in the room, with his constant outbursts showing how volatile and confrontational he truly was. The recordings of the Weepy Voiced Killer were played for the jury. Even though Paul had refused to admit to anything after his arrest, these confessions seemed to seal his fate. Although his legal team tried to challenge their authenticity and deny that the voice on the calls was Paul, it was obvious to everyone that it was him. And the fact that his ex-wife and his sister both said the voice was unmistakably his only cemented this for the jury. In the end, Paul was found guilty in both cases and was convicted for the attempted murder of Denise and the second-degree murder of Barbara, with the judge handing him a 58-year prison sentence. While the prosecution wanted to use this conviction as proof that Paul was the Weepy-voiced killer and charge him with the attack of Karen and murder of Kimberly as well, the judge ultimately ruled that the voice recordings alone were not sufficient to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This was because the hysterical manner of the calls distorted his voice, making it difficult to definitively prove it was him. As a result, he was never tried for either of the attacks. Paul maintained his innocence and continued denying it was his voice in the calls. Well, at least for the next 12 years anyway, because in 1997, something happened that caused him to decide it was finally time to confess again, one last time. After being diagnosed with terminal skin cancer in prison and given only a few months to live, Paul requested to speak with the investigators, saying he wanted to confess to everything before he passed away. When the investigators met with him, Paul told them that he had attacked Denise and Karen and murdered Barbara and Kimberly, confirming what they already knew. But shockingly, he then confessed to another murder. He described in chilling detail to them how he had entered Kathleen's house in Lauderdale before strangling and drowning her in her bathtub. Up until that point, he had never even been considered as a suspect in the murder of Kathleen, with nothing about the case matching any of his typical methods or behaviours. But they were able to confirm his story was true, with Paul providing detailed descriptions of the apartment and the murder that he could not have known if he hadn't been responsible. He also revealed to them that he actually knew Kathleen, claiming he had met her several times, and he even claimed that he had feelings for her. Unlike his other victims, it was clear that Kathleen was very specifically chosen by him, though he never elaborated as to why. It was at this point that the investigators discovered Paul's phone number in her address book listed as Paul S. They also discovered that Kathleen's purse had been found in a mailbox, just like Barbara's had after her murder, further linking Paul to the crime. The reasons for why Paul truly chose to confess to his crimes on his deathbed are unclear. You could argue that the devoutly religious man genuinely believed he would absolve himself of his sins by confessing before he died, allowing him to get into heaven. But the investigators and prosecutors were not convinced Paul's confessions were ever about religion or unburdening himself. Instead, they believed that even as he was dying, Paul was still seeking control. He wanted to control his own narrative and legacy. He wanted to gain one last rush of satisfaction. He wanted people to know what he'd done. And perhaps he even wanted people to question how many other murders he might have been responsible for, increasing his infamy and notoriety. They did not think Paul was seeking forgiveness. And to be honest, I'm not sure Paul was ever really seeking forgiveness in his emotional, exaggerated 911 calls. While it's possible he was hearing voices and entering dissociative states during his murders like he claimed, the evidence doesn't seem to back that up. Instead, it seems more like Paul was taunting and mocking the police and his victims, and that it was all a performance, done for reasons that will only ever truly be understood by himself. In his final days, Paul contacted a journalist, Caroline Lowe, asking her to send letters to his victims' families, in which he requested they put flowers on their graves from him. Caroline refused to be his messenger and never delivered the letters, believing that whatever his motives were, they were not about his victims, but about himself. Finally, on June 12, 1998, Paul passed away at the age of 53 in Oak Park Heights Prison in Minnesota. And the answers to what truly motivated him to make all those calls and confessions and to become the Weepy Voiced Killer were taken with him to the grave. And with that, our deep dive into the case of the Weepy Voiced Killer comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe, and drop a comment down below to let me know your thoughts. Given this is the first video I've fully narrated myself, I'd also love to hear what you all made of my attempt, and whether it's something you want me to continue doing on the channel. If you want to support my channel further, there's a membership option here on YouTube and a Patreon linked below. I can't offer much of anything in the way of perks right now, so it's really just about providing support for the channel at the moment, though I do try and get my videos up early on Patreon when I can. Until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss.
Oh, you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody.